Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is Leil Shishi. We're about to begin lesson 5, and we are about a third of the way into Perek Aleph of Tanya. We left off last week with a few questions, and the last of them being how do we resolve the contradiction whether God created human beings as wicked or righteous, a contradiction between the words of Eov in Bava Basra and the statement in the Gemara Nida. But before we answer those questions, we're actually, in other words, we're remaining confused as to what the precise status of a Benoni is. But the Alter Rebbe continues now to try to probe, to understand the meaning of this term that we coined in English as an in-betweener, but to really understand what is this entity, what is this creature, what is this Jew called a Benoni. So he says as follows. V'gam lahavin muhus madregas habenoni. We also need a real understanding of the status, the essence of the Benoni, the in-betweener. In other words, when you ask someone, what is the muhus, what is the essence of a tzaddik? The answer is simple. He's toiv. His essence is good. When you ask, what is the essence of a rasha, of a wicked person? The answer is simple. His essence is ra, it's bad. What is the essence of the Benoni? What is the essence of this in-betweener Jew? Shebevadai, the Alter Rebbe says, you definitely can't be understood that the Benoni is a person whose proportion of merits to transgression is equal. You know, he's a guy that's 50-50. 50% good, 50% negative. Because if that were the case, that it was a 50-50, then how would Rabbah make a mistake, as he started explaining last week, to think that he's a Benoni? In other words, humility is not when you make an error that's out of proportion. That's not humility. That's falsehood. As Rabbi Steinzelt said, if a very tall person says, I'm short, because he wants to be humble, that's not humility. If a very short person, for whatever reason, wants to say they're tall, that's not humility. That's falsehood. There's a difference between falsehood and humility. And if Rabbah is saying that he's a Benoni, it cannot by any realm of understanding mean that a Benoni is a 50-50 Jew, the 50% negative, 50% positive, 50% mitzvahs, 50% averis, because that is not something that Rabbah would ever make such a mistake about, right? If Rabbah stood up in the Gemara and said, I only eat chazer, I only eat bacon 40% of the time, right? Still 50% mitzvahs, that's not what we're talking about. It can't be what we're talking about. Furthermore, if you want to talk about Rabbah in particular, you take one little peek at Rabbah's life and what we know from Talmudic and Midrashic statements about Rabbah, you come to the realization that this man was a unique giant, a holy giant. The Gemara says in Bava Metzia, and the Rebbe quotes it here in Perek Aleph about Rabbah, we know that Rabbah famously did not ever stop studying Torah, to the extent that even the angel of death could not overpower him, since he was always occupied with Torah mitzvahs. The Gemara says a fascinating tale in Bava Metzia that Rabbah was so devoted to learning that when it was his time to go to heaven, because there was a big debate with the Mesifta Durakia in the heavenly abode, there was a big discussion about a Torah topic, and Rabbah had opinions, and they couldn't get him out of this physical world. And the angel of death came, and the angel of death rustled, created a rustling in the trees where Rabbah was learning. It sounded like the enemies that were pursuing Rabbah were coming. And so Rabbah had to make a choice. Am I going to die through stopping to learn, or am I going to die by letting them kill me? And he stopped for a moment in his learning, and that's when the angel of death, that's when the Malach HaMavis was able to take him. A guy that needs to find a way to die, or a guy that Malach HaMavis, a rabbi, a rav, a sage, a posek, a scholar, that the angel of death needs to find a unique circumstance in order to find him not doing something holy to take him from this world, means he's one of our best and brightest, one of our holiest, one of our most righteous. And if that's the case, says the Alter Rebbe, there's no way that Rabbah could have confused himself and thought that maybe he's a 50-50 Jew. That would be a falsehood. It would be a silliness. It would be foolish. We know that his learning, by the way, Rabbah's learning was not only a quantitative learning, but if you study up in the Gemara and the Mefarshim about Rabbah, the quality of his learning was something incredibly unique. So you had Kamus and Echos, qualitative learning, quantitative learning, and this guy thinks a Benoni, he's a Benoni. It's no way that that's pshat, that Benoni over there means that he was 50-50. So we definitely ruled out at this point the simple meaning that a Benoni means a 50-50 Jew. Now we're going to question the very notion about whether it's even possible to be an in-betweener Jew, to be a Benoni. Why? So he says like this, when a person does an Aveira, when a person does a sin, they're immediately classified by the sages, by Chazal, as being wicked. By the way, the Rebbe points out, I have to mention this just because I'm having so much fun with it, that for those who have the ability, it's in a very deep Hebrew, it's Lashon Kodesh, it's not in English and it's not in Yiddish, but if you have the ability to learn in depth this Tanya Hashalom that I mentioned in the first book, the new Tanya with all the Mefarshim, it is mind-blowing, the commentary. The compilation of the Rabbeim's interpretation on Tanya is just, it's wild. It stimulates the mind in ways that is truly incomprehensible. Over there, it says in Tanya Hashalom that there's a famous teaching in the Rambam in Hilchos Edus, in the laws of testifying and testimony, that a Rasha is qualified by someone who is Chayiv Malkus, who is punishable by lashes. That's what a Rasha is. So the Rebbe says that, yes, what it says in the Rambam is referring specifically to a biblical term for Rasha. But in general, if you look through the Chazal, through the Midrashim and the Gemara, even someone who does one Aveira, not just an Aveira, not just a sin where you're punishable by malchus, by lashes, but any sin, you're a Rasha. V'im achar kach asad tshuva, if you subsequently did tshuva, you repented, then you're a Tzadik Gomer. You're called a total, complete Tzadik, which is in its own right an interesting teaching, because there's a famous machloikis. I sound like those rabbis who say things are famous when they're not really famous, but it sounds good when you say it's famous. There's an argument between the Ur Zarua, the famous Viennese rabbi who wrote the Sefer in the 13th century, but it wasn't printed until the 19th century, Rabbi Yitzchak ben Moshe of Vienna. So the Ur Zarua, there's a big debate about when a person says, Harei at mekudeshesli, you are sanctified to me. He says to a woman, you are sanctified to me as a wife, al manashani tzadik gomer, on condition that I'm a complete tzaddik. The Ur Zarua says that if you say that, it's a valid statement. In other words, the Ur Zarua is of the opinion that if someone does immediate tshuva, and they are considered at that moment to be a tzaddik gomer, a complete tzaddik, and if that's the case, if they sanctify a woman for kiddushin, for marriage, by saying al manashani tzaddik gomer, it's valid. Not everyone agrees with the Ur Zarua. Some of the poskim say that only if you say al manashani tzaddik, on condition that I'm a tzaddik, but not a tzaddik gomer, not a complete tzaddik. They differentiate between the two, but clearly here, it seems like the Alter Rebbe here, and also in Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe and Siman and Gimel and Erech Chaim says the term Tzadik Gomer, which means Alter Rebbe is taking on that ruling of the Ur Zarua, that if a person does tshuva, they're immediately considered a Tzadik Gomer. So then again, we have this big dilemma. Who's a Benoni? If you sin, you're a Rasha. If you do tshuva, you're a Tzadik Gomer. You're a total, complete tzaddik. So what is the essence of this Benoni character. So some would say maybe a Benoni is someone that's super scrupulous, super devoted to Torah Shebchsav, to biblical mitzvahs, the Eraisa, mitzvahs that are of biblical origin, but not so makbid, not so stringent, not so devoted to mitzvahs that are the Rabbanan, that are of rabbinic origin. Says the Alter Rebbe, we can't say that either. Even a person who violates a minor rabbinic prohibition, Mikre Russia is considered a Russia, could the Isa Perik Beis the Abamas, as it says in chapter 2 of the Gemara Yavamas, in the first chapter of Masech Nida, on Daf Yud Beis. It says that if someone breaks Divrei Seifrim, someone breaks the rules that were instituted by the sages, by the Chachamim, it says Beferish, it says clearly in two different Gemaras, you're considered a Russia. So that means the in-betweener, the Benoni, he's not a Russia, which means he can't even break rabbinic precepts. So we ruled out that he's not 50-50. We ruled out that he's not someone who didn't do tshuva, because he had done tshuva, he'd be a tzaddik gomer. We ruled out that he can never stop learning Torah because Rabbah considered himself a Benoni. He goes, what about maybe it's somebody, that the Benoni is somebody who does good, he lives a good, holy life, and he never does a sin, he never transgresses himself, but maybe he allows other people to transgress. Says the Alter Rebbe, that can't be either. Why? If you look in chapter 6 of Masech Shavuos in Perek Vav, it says that if you have the opportunity to reprimand someone else for failing to do a mitzvah, or for failing, or for transgressing a sin, and you don't do it, you sit silently, then you're a Russia. So that means the Benoni can't be someone that ignores other people's transgressions, other people's iniquity. Furthermore, the kol shekim v'kal v'chomer, how much more so, that if you have an opportunity to do a positive commandment and you actively neglect from doing the positive commandment, you're for sure considered a Russia. For example, what's the example that Alter Rebbe gives? And this is one, by the way, the sages said 1,800 years ago, the sages already said, and the Talmudic sages, that there's a few things that ein adam nitzel ben b'chol yom, that a person cannot save themselves from ever passing a day without transgressing. One of them is bittul Torah. If that was the case then, today, with smartphones and all the distractions we have, the amount of time we spend that we could be spending learning Torah and we don't is unfortunately very high. Says the Alter Rebbe, if you have the opportunity to do a mitzvah and you don't do it, you're a Russia. For example, what is the example he gives? Anyone that has the opportunity to involve themselves in limud Torah, in the study of Torah, and they neglect the opportunity to study Torah. All of Darsha Razal, the Gemara in Sanhedrin quotes from the pasuk in Bamidbar, Kidvar Hashem Baza, they desecrated God's contempt. They had contempt for God's words. What does it say? Karis to karis, their soul should be cut off. Karis, just from not learning Torah. By the way, it's interesting because there's a talk about an argument or a debate. The Lechem Mishnah, on his commentary on the Rambam, says that when it says you get cut off for not learning Torah, it's not talking about someone who just doesn't end up learning. It's talking about specifically someone that looks at Torah study, shem nivzim be'enav. They look down at Torah study. They don't find value in Torah study. They deliberately choose, not someone who just spaces out or gets distracted and doesn't end up learning. But the Alter Rebbe here clearly takes on the opinion, not like the Lechem Mishnah, like the other poskim, who say it doesn't matter what your intentions are. If you have the opportunity to learn Torah and you don't, Dvar Hashem Baza, you have brought contempt to the word of God, and therefore you're liable for excision, for your soul to be cut off. You think about that, you go, oh Lord. I mean, a Benoni means that a Benoni doesn't even lack the opportunity to study Torah and neglecting it. Upshita the Mikre Russia Obviously, this person is called a Rasha, more than just someone who breaks a rabbinic precept. Based on all of that, right? Because the Gemara says in Brachas, I think it's Daf Hey, the Gemara says, Pishpesh v'loy matzav, you start seeing that you're suffering. And you're starting to look, why is God making me suffer? And you can't find anything. Lubavitchers don't have this problem because we know our flaws. We're very good at recognizing our flaws. But imagine a Balgaiva, some arrogant person who looks and says, I don't know why God's punished me. I have no sins. So the Alter Rebbe said, the Gemara says in Brachas, that if you pishpish v'lei matzav, if you looked in all your character and your traits and your activities and you can't figure out why you're suffering, yitle b'bittul Torah, you could assume it's probably because of bittul Torah, because you had opportunities to learn Torah and you didn't. So the Benoni doesn't have any of this. It's clear, therefore, we are forced to conclude that when we talk about a Benoni, the in-betweener, it's not someone that's guilty even of neglecting Torah study. Therefore, it becomes clear that a tzaddik and a Benoni, based on this, can seem to the naked eye, to the external viewer, a tzaddik and a Benoni can come across as indistinguishable. Because in their actions, they're both pretty holy. In the way they live their lives, they're pretty holy. And now we can understand, and that is why Rabbah was able to make the mistake about himself and call himself a Benoni. We don't know yet why Rabbah, the reasoning, the exact reason of why he considered himself a Benoni. But one thing is clear, at least we can understand now why there's a reasonable claim for someone who's a tzaddik to think that they're a Benoni. Because the Benoni is this unique creature who may have not eradicated the full evil essence in his core, but the way he's living his life practically is literally pretty impressive. He's living like a righteous person. And here we have the Haggah. Throughout Tanya, you're going to see Haggahs, which are little side notes. Some people thought that the reason the Alter Rebbe put certain things in Haggah is when they were in Yanim of Kabbalah. Ideas of Kabbalah he would put in a side note. But the Rebbe characteristically says that that's not the case. It's just things that are not directly connected to the content of what he's trying to teach in Tanya. But there is an important side note there that he'd like us to know, sort of like a commercial message, and that's in the Haggah. So what does the Alter Rebbe say in the Haggah here? He says, we just basically said that even a Benoni doesn't have any of these sinful activities, then we seemingly have a problem with a statement in the Zohar. It says in the Zohar, on page 231 in Zohar, in section 1, in part 3, page 231 of the Zohar, it says, any tzaddik who has a few transgressions, right? The Zohar is talking about a tzaddik v'raloi. And back then, the assumption was that a tzaddik v'raloi, a tzaddik who has it bad, is a tzaddik who suffers in this world. Why does he suffer in this world? So the Zohar mentions he suffers in this world for the sins that he did. That seems to contradict everything we just said. Even a Benoni doesn't have any sins. So why over there in the Zohar does it seem to indicate that a tzaddik v'raloi has sins? So the Alter Rebbe says, when you look at the Zohar and you look at it, today they call it a quote taken out of context. And this is very much that. Why? Because that statement about the suffering of the tzaddik v'raloi, and that the suffering is a result of his sinfulness, even though his sinfulness is a small amount according to that statement, it says sinfulness, and that he's suffering in this world so that in the world to come, in the afterlife, he shouldn't have any suffering there. He says, that is not an accurate quote because that is Shilas Rav Hamnuna Eliyahu. That was a question that Rav Hamnuna was asking of Eliyahu. It was a question, it wasn't a conclusion. Right? Rav Hamnuna was asking Eliyahu, doesn't the meaning of tzaddik v'raloi, a tzaddik who has bad, refer to a man who suffers in this world because this way he gets rid of those punishments before he goes to the world to come? That was the question being asked. But if you look at the answer that Eliyahu gave Rav Hamnuna, that's not the meaning. Rav Eliyahu corrects Rav Hamnuna and says, Pirush Tzadik v'Raloi, that what is the explanation of a Tzadik v'Raloi is that it's a Tzadik who has a negative element that is quashed. And if they do suffer in this world, and this is a complicated topic, but they suffer because they're connected to other students of theirs, to other Jews, and they're taking in some of the pain and the punishment for other Jews in the generation that are misbehaving, which the Gemara talks about, the Medrash talks about, that there's this concept where a tzaddik, even in the first mimer of the Rebbe and Basi Lagani, that a tzaddik feels the pain of the generation and ends up suffering as a result. But Eliyahu's answer to Rav Hamnuna was that it's not pshat, Tzadik v'Raloi, that he's suffering as a result of his sins, because again, based on what we said, and based on Eliyahu's answer, it's Tzadik v'Raloi, and even a Benoni doesn't sin. So then why did Rav Hamnuna have such a wrong understanding of what a Tzadik v'Raloi is? So that's the last three words of the Alter Rebbe in the Haggah. In the side note is, V'shivim ponim l'Torah, that there's 70 ways. We know the Medrash says in Medrash Rabbah that there are 70 ways and layers, facets to understand the Torah. Rav Hamnuna was toying with the idea that maybe there, in one of the 70 ways of understanding Torah, the pshat, the understanding of Tzadik v'Raloi, could mean that they do have some sins. But even with that, he wasn't correct. Eliyahu had to correct him. There is no room in any of the layers of Torah understanding that a tzaddik would have sinfulness for which he had to pay a price in this world. Now back into the Tanya, says the Alter Rebbe, if we concluded that a Benoni doesn't have any sins and isn't, God forbid, a Jew who's 50-50, 50% sinful, 50% righteous, then we need to understand why we see in different places in the Gemara, in Chazal, that they use the term Benoni when it's not talking about someone of that level of righteousness. So he says like this, and this is very important because in Jewish communities, in Jewish learning, in Jewish expression, we throw around a lot of words. I don't want to offend Jewish mothers, but I'm going to do it anyhow. Jewish mothers have a tendency of telling their kids every Monday and Thursday, tzaddik, you're such a tzaddik. Then the kid grows up and opens up a Tanya, and Severt finster in the egg, and it becomes very dark. His world is darkened. My mother told me I was a tzaddik. I'm starting to read Tanya. If only I'm lucky enough in my life, halavai Benoni, that I should be even in between or a Benoni. So I think with verbiage, we throw around a lot of language, and sometimes there is validity to it. For example, if you go to a courtroom and you have a trial and the judge says, we find the defendant, the jury says, we find the defendant not guilty. Finding a defendant not guilty, or finding a defendant guilty for that matter, does not mean that they are 100% guilty or 100% not guilty. It just means, based on the evidence and based on what was provided in the courtroom, we had to make a decision, and he looks more righteous than sinful, or he looks more sinful than righteous. But that's not the essence of the person, and a jury can't really determine the essence of a person anyhow. So, but we throw around terms that become part of the lingo and part of the verbiage, part of the societal and even Jewish societal language, which isn't accurate. So the Alter Rebbe needs to address that, and he addresses it right now. So even though when you look in rabbinic text, you will see a common reference that a Benoni, the word Benoni, is someone who has an equal proportion of sin, transgression, and an equal proportion of merits. And a tzaddik is someone who has majority merits, like the Gemara says in Rosh Hashanah. And you say to yourself, well, how do you reconcile the Talmudic understanding of Benoni and what the Alter Rebbe is trying to say over here? So he says it's a very important distinction we need to make. In the Gemara, in Chazal, in the Midrashim, in rabbinic text, when you see the term tzaddik and Benoni or Rasha, the understanding is very different than the essence. Why? He says when you see it in the rabbinic text, when it comes to divine punishment and reward, when we're trying to illustrate someone who's worthy of punishment and someone who is worthy of reward, the sages use the term of Tzadik Benoni in Russia as a figurative term, a borrowed term. So when it comes to terminology, there's something called Shem Ha'etzem, a name that reflects the essence of something. So if I have a table or a desk in my office and I call the desk a desk, that's Shem Ha'etzem. It is a desk. Then there's a concept called Shem HaToyar. Shem HaToyar is like a title. It's not the essence of the person. It's not the essence of the item. It's a title. You're strong. You're weak. You're beautiful. The desk looks like mahogany. It's a title. It's not the essence of the item. It's a title on the item. But here the Alter Rebbe introduces a third type of name. It's called Shem HaMushal, a figurative, a borrowed type, a borrowed name. What's pshat? What does that mean? It means there are some characteristics in this statement that are, compared to the essence, but it's not the essence. So when the rabbinic texts talk about a tzaddik and a benoni, what they're trying to say is that they have a tzaddik, for example, has more righteousness than negativity, which is why they are rewarded with merit, or they have less righteousness, so they are punished with punishment. But it's not referring to the essence of the individual. It's a term used because we don't have a better one. It's a figurative term, and he says, because a person is judged by God according to the majority of their transgressions or their merits. God does judge us by majority versus minority. And you're classified as righteous in the verdict when you're acquitted by judgment. So if you look at the Rambam and the laws of tshuva, the Rambam talks about this, that when a person's life is looked at, it is assessed based on what the majority of their life was. Did they behave righteously or negatively? Wickedly or holy? But that's just a figurative term to give us some idea of who's going to be acquitted in court versus someone who's going to be sentenced in court. But it's not the essence of what a tzaddik is, because we can never say that a tzaddik is someone who has partial sin, because he's not a tzaddik, he's not even a benoni. So there's a difference between a righteous in verdict and a righteous person. Now the Rebbe is addressing what is a righteous person and what is a in-between person and what is a wicked person. He's not addressing who is righteous in verdict and who is wicked in verdict and who is in between in the verdict. So we clearly demonstrated thus far that the Rebbe is trying to address the precise meaning of what a tzaddik is, and what is clear that neither a tzaddik or a benoni, based on what the Rebbe is trying to accomplish in the essence of what they are guilty of any transgressions at all. The tzaddik and the benoni have no averos, they have no transgressions. So if they have none, what distinguishes them? Before he answers that, he says something even further. And that is the only real definition we have is from the Gemara and Brachas. So we go back to where we had last week from the tractate of Brachas. What does it say in Brachas about the definition? Right? Because it can't be anything that we said before. A benoni can't mean any of those things. And if a tzaddik and a benoni look alike, then what do we know about the difference between the two? So he says, let's go back for a minute to the Gemara Brachas. What does it say in Brachas? But when speaking of the true inner quality that distinguishes the character of a tzaddik and a benoni, our sages, the Chazal saying Gemara Bracha, tzaddikim yetzer tov shoftam, that in the case of tzaddikim, their impulse to good is their internal judge. We don't know exactly what that means, but we do know is that it says in the Gemara that what does it mean that they're only judged by their good inclination? What happened to their evil inclination? So he says, "Shenemar v'libi cholal b'kirbi." David HaMelech says in Psalms, in Tehillim, Kapitel Kuf Tes, he says, "My heart is empty within me." What does that mean? So the Gemara in Yerushalmi says, "She'en lo yetzer hara," he has no evil inclination. What happened to his evil inclination? So in one place it says in Korban Eda, Ki harge b'tainus, that he killed the Yetzer Hara by fasting. In the Zohar it says he annihilated his Yetzer Hara through learning Torah. But over here in the Tanya, the Rebbe quotes the understanding that he killed it with fasting. In other words, he abused his physical body to the point that his evil inclination ceased to exist. It became a void in his heart. Now, it's interesting, very interesting, and in Gemara we'd say halt cup. I want you to keep track here for a minute, something very fascinating. And the Rebbe quotes this in great length in the Tanya. It's printed in the Tanya Shalom. He says, Avram Avinu, when it comes to this issue of eradicating the evil inclination, Avram Avinu did better. The Gemara Yerushalmi says that Avram Avinu did better than David HaMelech, than King David. Why? By Avram Avinu it says, I found his heart to be wholesome. We say it every morning in davening. What does it mean? The Gemara says it means he transformed his evil inclination into being good. David HaMelech, King David, eradicated his evil inclination. He got rid of it. Avram Avinu reached the epitome. What's the epitome? Transformation. Then the Rebbe asks, if that's the case, we know the famous Mishnah that says you have to serve God, the Haptus Hashem Alekecha, you shall love the Lord your God, b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meidecha. And what does b'chol levavcha mean? B'shnei yitzarecha, with both your inclinations. How did David HaMelech serve God with both his inclinations? If he eradicated one, he killed one. He fasted to the point of that it was obliterated. So the Rebbe gives three answers as to how David HaMelech still fulfilled the obligation to serve God with both your inclinations, even though he seemingly killed his inclination. The first thing the Rebbe says is that it was a progressive journey for David. First, he killed the evil inclination, and then he transformed it. So first he knocked it out, and then he transformed it to become part of his service of Hashem as a good entity within himself. Now, how exactly, I try to figure out how exactly that works. How do you kill the evil inclination and eradicate it and then transform it? I'm not sure how that plays out, but also I'm not David HaMelech and I'm not Avram Avinu, so maybe that's why I don't really have a deep understanding of it. The second explanation the Rebbe gives is that he killed it in the sense that he subdued it. He didn't transform it like Avram Avinu, but he subdued it enough that it was considered killed. It was considered knocked out. And thirdly, the Rebbe says that every one of us in davening, when we daven properly, I think it was last week in Hayom Yom that the Rebbe says that the novelty of a chassid is tefillah. I think I mentioned in the first class that the Alter Rebbe had to choose between going to Vilna and going to the Mizitcha Magid, and there was a difference between going to the so-called hallmarks of Torah study versus the place that will teach him to serve Hashem in tefillah and davening. And he said, learning, I know how to learn. Let me go learn how to daven. Something to that effect. Davening is a staple of what it means to be a chassid. Not just pirush hamilas, not just understanding what you're saying, but to have true dveikus, true devotion in davening, to understand what you're saying, to connect with its essence, and in the process to subdue the negativity, to eradicate it from within yourself. And so David HaMelech is teaching us that every Jew has the ability, even if it's not long-term, but short-term, when we daven, we have the ability every day, 3 times a day, to kill our Yetzer Hara with fasting. What's pshat? To kill our Yetzer Hara through prayer, through removing ourselves, fasting, not just by not eating or drinking, but we're removing our pleasures from the physical realm. We have the ability to kill the Yetzer Hara, and that's why the Alter Rebbe specifically quotes David HaMelech and not Avram Avinu, because that's something we can relate to. We cannot, most of us don't have access to transforming our Yetzer Hara to the Yetzer Tov. That's a Avram Avinu activity. But David HaMelech's activity, even if for him it was something long-term, we can include short-term annihilations of our evil inclination in our davening. Going back to what he says here, if we're talking about someone who eradicated his evil inclination, and that's what it essentially means, is but anyone who has not yet reached this level of annihilating the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination within themselves, the impulse for evil, even if the merits outweigh the sins, the transgressions, you're not a tzaddik at all. In other words, we're still at square one. We need to understand who this Benoni is, but as we're going along, it's clear that a tzaddik has no connection to the impulse of evil. And when it says tzaddik, it doesn't mean someone that has partial sins, because that cannot mean a tzaddik. A tzaddik has totally eradicated it. And therefore, it's clear that the tzaddik who has annihilated his evil inclination is a very rare commodity. If we're using David HaMelech as the example, even if David HaMelech is not Avraham Avinu, it's a rare commodity. The Medrash, that's why our sages said in the Medrash, it's actually a Gemara in Yuma, but it's also a Medrash in Yalkut Shemoini. God saw that there are few righteous people, there are few righteous souls, there's not a lot of them. He carefully placed them in each generation. Now, if there was only a few, if it was so easy to be a tzaddik, then it wouldn't be only a few, right? Because there's, if what it means to be a tzaddik is just to have a majority good, and you're 51% good versus 49% evil, or 49% transgression, then it wouldn't be only a few. The fact that the Medrash and the Gemara tell us that there was only a few such souls and God implanted them throughout generations, it means that it's a much higher category when we use the term tzaddik. Because if tzaddik just meant 50-50 or 51-49, it wouldn't be a few of them. There'd be tens of thousands of Jews who are 51% positive versus 49% negative. Actually, it's interesting. He says v'chulu, because the Gemara there says a different pasuk. How do you know that there's only a small amount of righteous people and they're implanted all over in different generations? He says, Ki la'Hashem etzuki eretz. God has the pillars of the earth. God created the pillars of the earth. But Yashas aleim tevel, Toshas aleim tevel, and he put them all over he implanted them as foundations all over the world. So there's one part of the Gemara that says that there's a lot of righteous people that are spread across generations, but clearly not the majority, because if it just meant 50-50, there'd be a lot more than that. But then the Gemara says a secondary thing, and that's a whole different animal. It's not just righteous people that are implanted all over. You know, I learned Tanya for many, many years, and I never caught this detail until today. That when the Alter Rebbe quotes this Gemara and he says v'chulu, he's referring to the verse. He's referring to the verse that emphasizes that every generation has a few righteous people. But then there's another level of tzaddik that the Gemara talks about, and that Alter Rebbe says that as well. As it says, that tzaddik yisoid olam, that tzaddik is the foundation of the world. And that's a tzaddik in the singular, not in the plural. So you have the many tzaddikim, or I should say not many, but you have the group of tzaddikim that are a minority of souls that Hashem plants in all generations, and they are truly pillars of the Jewish experience and pillars of the existence of the world. But then you have a tzaddik yisoid olam. You have in each generation, you have a tzaddik yisoid olam, a tzaddik who himself singularly is the pillar of the world. So clearly, the terminology in the rabbinic text of a tzaddik being 50-50 is only regards to the verdict, not regarding the essence of who these tzaddikim are, because tzaddikim are much, much holier and more righteous than just 50-50. They're a whole different type of existence that most of us have no iota of how to tap into. If we're lucky enough, we get to meet one of them or deal with one of them or get to know one of them, but that's for the most of us. And if that's the case, we managed to define by process of elimination, what a Benoni is not. He's not a Rasha. He never did any particular transgressions. He's also not a tzaddik who eliminated his total Yetzirah, he eliminated his impulse for evil. So a Benoni is someone on the outside seems perfect, but on the inside still has a little rot going on the inside. But of course, if I gave you the whole Tanya now in Parag Aleph, we wouldn't have to learn any further. So we're going to wait till the Alter Rebbe goes back to that. And I just want to leave off with something interesting that I read in one of the commentaries. It could be from the Rebbe, but it could be from the other Rebbeim. The verse that the Alter Rebbe quotes here from the Gemara, that Tzadik Yisoid Olam, that every generation has a pillar, a Tzadik who keeps the generation anchored in holiness, is very different than what the Rambam says. Because the Rambam says in Hilchos Tshuva, and this is a halacha and Rambam that the Rebbe Zatzal would quote all the time, and that is that you always have to see the world as 50-50, a scale of 50-50, and when you do one mitzvah, you can tip the scale and bring Mashiach. Now, and which pasuk does the Rambam use, which verse to prove that? Tzadik Yisod Olam. You just need one tzaddik to tip the scale. But we're not talking about a tzaddik. Even a Russia who does one mitzvah can tip the scale. So obviously the Rambam, when using that verse of Tzadik Yisod Olam, doesn't mean a person who's essentially a tzaddik. It means someone who does an act of a tzaddik, even if they may be a Russia, and they can transform the world and tip the scale. Over here, the Alter Rebbe is not referring to that. Here, the Alter Rebbe is referring to Tzadik Yisod Olam, someone who essentially is not a Russia doing a good deed and transforming the world or tipping the scale, but an actual Tzadik and Shema Etzem. It's their essence, it's who they are. And knowing that allows us to know that it's certainly not the 50-50. Therefore, a Benoni looks like a Tzadik, even though he may have rot on the inside. And if that's the case, we have to really understand how that works. In other words, we really need to understand what this inner struggle looks like for someone who acts like a tzaddik, but has this little rot voice within them that still exists. And to understand that, the Alter Rebbe is going to go into explaining this revolutionary concept of two souls. But for that, you have to stay tuned for next week, when we're going to delve into the two neshamas, which we will learn Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach with God's help and His incredible grace next week, God willing. Have a wonderful rest of the week. A good Erev Shabbos, and we'll see you back here soon. I'm going to stop the recording and open it up for any questions. Sei gesund.